that a lot of people didn't qualify for because they filled out the paperwork wrong. And so there was sort of this like attitude of, we're going to do whatever we need to do for the corporations, whether it's through TARP or all these programs that we're going to. The Fed actually hid this program. The only reason we know about this then secret Fed program is because two journalists at Bloomberg News FOIA'd the Fed. Then the Fed refused to give them the FOIA. They sued the Fed. The Fed fought them in court, and a bank trade association called the Clearinghouse and the Fed tried to fight in court against Bloomberg. Eventually, the Fed gave up. The bank clearinghouse kept the lawsuit going, and then the Supreme Court declined to take the case. So the only reason we even know that this secret program existed was because of Bloomberg News. There were some changes that were made to try to prevent this from happening again that I feel like now no longer apply. We once again, in this crisis, have the Fed doing unprecedented assistance for corporations. So unfortunately, I do think we have a little bit of history repeating ourselves. But the main point I want to make is we need to make sure that the programs that are supposed to help ordinary people are not cumbersome, are not difficult to apply for, are not designed to fail on purpose. And I think one of the lessons of the 2008 crisis was that, unfortunately, was the case. There wasn't one single program to help ordinary people in the 2008 fallout. There was HAMP, there was HARP, there were all of these really specific programs. And a lot of the programs, not even all the money got used. Some of the money got returned to the Treasury. And again, that's because the programs were so difficult. A, people didn't know they existed. B, they filled out the form wrong. And so in some ways, there was this attitude of corporations, we're just going to do whatever we need to do. Ordinary people need to jump through all these hoops. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of that happen once again. And so I think we need to think about when we make our asks and we make our demands, programs need to be simple, they need to be universal, they need to be easy to access. And we just need to get imaginative and make sure that we are being as bold and as aggressive in our advocacy as corporations are being in their lobbying and their advocacy for themselves. I will say one thing briefly about now, which is that, so the Federal Reserve is pumping all this money out. Some of it's good, right? Some of it's going to cities and towns. Some of it's going to corporations. They tapped a Wall Street giant named BlackRock to oversee the buying and selling of corporate bonds. And BlackRock is now also buying and selling what are called ETFs, which are these financial products that BlackRock makes. And they're not allowed to get fees if they buy their own product. But if people know that the Fed is doing this, speculators also buy that ETF. So BlackRock is getting all this indirect profit because everyone on Wall Street's trying to game it and make money off of it. And so that's something I hope we can put some focus on and make sure that BlackRock isn't. Unfortunately, I think they're already getting a big benefit from this, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on. But yeah, simple programs and big imagination.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexis. And speaking of big imaginations, I know that there's the AFR, Americans for National Reform, has a 14 or so page document of the gaps in the stimulus bill. So there are plenty there, I know, but I know that you've been paying a lot of attention to student loans in particular. And what struck me is sort of more ambitious thinking than I've ever heard of has been coming up in the stimulus package. So I'd love if you could address sort of what's happening in that arena.
So we've seen a tectonic shift in the Democratic Party in terms of support for student debt cancellation. One of the interesting and unique things about federal student debt is the vast majority of it is held by the government. So the government has the power today, if they wanted to cancel federal student loans because they hold it. And there's actually a law that was passed in the 60s that gives the Secretary of Education the authority to, it's called compromise debt, but it's basically canceled debt. So if Betsy DeVos, woke up tomorrow morning and decided she wanted to cancel federal student loans, she could. That's unlikely to happen. So what we've seen this massive shift in the Democratic Party so far. We haven't seen any bipartisanship yet, but I, hold out some hope. We've seen Senate leadership on the Democratic side call for a minimum $10,000 cancellation of federal student loans. The Pelosi bill for package 3, which wasn't passed but was proposed, included having the government pay your federal student loan every month for the duration of the crisis, and then however much money was canceled, if it didn't add up to 10,000, they would cancel the rest so that you got a minimum 10,000 debt canceled. Joe Biden endorsed that proposal. I think there was a letter that went around by Representative Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar in support of canceling $30,000 in federal student loans. They have a bill called the Student Emergency Debt Aid Act, I think. There's 30 co-sponsors so far. So there's a lot of movement there, but the reason I think canceling student debt is a good idea, so there's two ways to get money to people, right? Give them cash, which we've seen some problems already, right? People that didn't file taxes in the past, like don't have direct deposit on file, they have to get a check in the mail, it takes longer, there's all these barriers. So you can give people cash, or you can reduce their expenses. And while not everyone has student debt, 43 million people in this country do have federal student loans. And because we have the power to wipe that out, it seems to me that that's a good, easy to operationalize thing that we could do to reduce expenses. And so there is some movement there. I can try and put my email in the chat if anyone wants more information or see some of the letters that we've put out. But there's, I would say, a growing momentum, at least on the Democrat side, and hopefully we can start to make this a bipartisan thing to include canceling federal student loans in the next stimulus. And I will say that there are studies that say that if we did cancel student debt in a wide scale way, it would boost the economy by over $100 billion a year, and it would create over 1 million new jobs a year. So even if you don't have student loans, this is something that would boost the economy for everyone. So it's both a sort of short-term reducing expenses for millions of people, but also a sort of stimulative economic thing to do.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you. And we'll move on now. We have a bunch of panelists and a lot of information to convey. So we're going to move on to Anne-Marie Reinhart from United for Respect. So the bailout that Alexis was just referencing, had all this. The folks might know had some strong support from private equity. And for people who don't know what private equity is, really the list of horrors is practically endless. But they essentially, they're firms that use investments from wealthy individuals and institutional investors to buy controlling shares of businesses, and they load those companies up with debt that those businesses, not the private equity firms, those businesses are then required to pay off. And so ultimately that ends up leading to a lot of layoffs of employees, to asset sell-offs. And all this is happening while, so the company's getting squeezed, and all this is happening while the private equity firms themselves are bringing in tons and tons of money, making all kinds of profits. So Anne-Marie, our next speaker, is with an organization, United for Respect, that actually took on private equity and won a $20 million financial assistance fund for the 33,000 people who lost their jobs when private equity destroyed Toys R Us. So that's a great story in its own right. You should totally read about it on the United for Respect website. But before we talk about private equity in the context of COVID, Anne-Marie, we know that you were a retail worker. You've been furloughed now. So can you tell us a bit about the incredibly important work that's happening with frontline workers now, who are now finally being recognized as essential?
Absolutely. United for Respect has been working with retail people for years. The organization first did start out just by organizing with Walmart. And this is really a crucial moment for retail at this time. One thing that we are focused on is to lift up these stories of the workers on the front lines. So as workers do report feeling unsafe at their jobs because they're seeing that the CDC guidelines that are not being implemented evenly across the board. One of the biggest retailers, which is Walmart, is showing us this now. So we're lifting up stories of Walmart workers like Melissa Love, who shows the hypocrisy of the executives calling workers essential when they do feel expendable. Melissa's op-ed was even published in the New York Times, which I was watching live when Jake Tapper asked the Walmart executive live on CNN. So Melissa's story is what we're hearing across the board, lifting up stories of workers on the front lines who are not feeling safe at their jobs. And just as this country right now, we are all focused on COVID-19, everything in our work revolves around issues at this particular moment. The pandemic kind of brings to light the ongoings of retail. The crisis that we're facing is made worse by the fact that people can't take sick time, and especially at a time like this. The fact that companies like Walmart think that they're doing a huge service by suspending attendance policies and calling it response to COVID, even though employers providing hazard pay, which amounts to about $2 an hour, is still not a living wage, and let alone compensation for putting their lives on the line every day. My daughter-in-law works at Big Lots, and she gets $2 an hour for hazard pay, and then immediately they started cutting everyone's hours after they did that. This is happening at all retailers, and it is standard practice. It's been happening long before the pandemic. So getting a raise, cutting hours, we've all gone through that at one point or another. And at this moment, it is much more unconscionable. So of course, we're making a lot of demands on corporations at this moment, and we believe that employees deserve a safe place to work and access to washing hand stations, breaks, PPE, actual hazard pay, and paid sick time.
Excellent. Thank you. So yes, as I'm sure folks have been hearing, sort of in the media, unless, you're like me, sometimes you need to flee from, news coverage for a little bit, but that's horrible stuff. And Anne-Marie, sadly, you not only have experience with private equity and, as increasing numbers are having now at Toys R Us, but when you left Toys R Us, your next employer, the one who furloughed you as COVID hit the US, is also owned by private equity. So could you just tell us a bit about the role you've seen private equity play in retail and the economy in general, because we know that they are trying to take more and more space up in this and through the bailouts?
After private equity they took down Toys R Us, I did move into a department store, which I was under the impression was family owned. I'm in the South. Belk is a department store that is mainly in the South, and they have been family owned. So I'm currently working there, and I'm listening to employees. I'm a new employee. I hear them that they don't have paper towels. They don't have bags at their registers, and all these little things that were kind of red flags to me. So with that being said, I overheard a conversation that they said, well, it was better before we were bought out. And I said, bought out by who? And when they said it was a private equity firm, I don't even want to tell you the feeling that I had. So I'm currently part of a committee there where with the grocery. So we also, I want to get to the part because I'm going to skip over that. So as I watch this happen, I was away for a few days, and I kind of got a phone call while I was in New York, and they said that they were changing their policies, their attendance policy, their full-time, part-time policy. I came back to find out that they had closed their flagship store in Charlotte. They laid off 80 employees in their corporate office, which I found on the local news. And also I came back to my own store where they had eliminated numerous full-time jobs. And that to me was deja vu from Toys R Us, because when private equity took over our store, that's how they started, was eliminating full-time jobs. People lost their health insurance and so on. And so I'm seeing this all happen all over again at the store that I'm working at now.
Wow, that is horrible, and I'm sorry to hear it. Anne-Marie will be talking as well during this webinar about some of the strategies we can use to fight back. And as Anne-Marie's just mentioning, sort of how vulnerable sort of retail workers are right now, and I'm imagining it won't surprise many folks that retail workers of color face sort of some of the most substantial challenges. So a 2015 report by Think and Do Tank, Demos, found that Black and Latino retail workers are more likely to live below the poverty line, are underrepresented in supervisory positions, and are paid less than their white counterparts in the frontline retail sales force. So again, that's probably not stunning for you. It's probably also not news to you that the economy, that sort of capitalism in the United States has always been racialized. The financialization of the economy has always been racialized. So our next speaker, Tia Oso, the senior communities strategist for ACRE, the Action Center on Race and the Economy, is going to help us dive into that a little bit. So Tia, during the last recession, as Alexis mentioned, the banks really came out ahead, especially compared to the rest of us in general, and people of color in particular. So I know ACRE, and we'd love to hear sort of more about what you do there. That they've tackled the central role of Wall Street and putting municipal budgets under what we call budgetary distress, right? So, could you tell us a little bit more about what you and Acre mean by this budgetary distress, and how Wall Street is undermining not just sort of everything on the federal level, but local budgets, and what that means for for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and taxpayers in general?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for inviting Acre to be a part of this conversation. It's really important. So at Action Center on Race and the Economy, we do research and collaborative campaign development and capacity building with organizations to work at the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability. We have identified different pillars of racialized capitalism and how it functions, and one of these is public budgets. And so what's important for us to understand is that the attack on public budgets is actually a racialized attack. So public services, as they were initially envisioned in this country, were thought of as like too important to entrust into the hands of a private sector and profit motive, right? So our water, the functions of our municipal activities and departments. And as the Civil Rights Act was passed and governments had to be more inclusive and provide equal protections under the law, equal provisions under the law to communities of color as well as white communities, that's where you start to see opening the door to private companies and private equity, and these ideas about, well, privatization and letting the private sector take care of things is now acceptable. Now it's acceptable for us to have a profit motive. And so the ways that we see that happening is that we see governments and municipalities that are being led by austerity budgets and with right-wing political ideologies of wanting to have small government, right? And like shifting and shrinking budgets, creating a distress where now the private sector has to come in and rescue our communities. This is, one of the most kind of prevalent cases of this that we see is what happened with in Flint, Michigan, with the water rights. And the second point that is important for us to understand is that as the private sector has more motivation to be operating in competition with the public sector, we also see us creating this crisis of budgets. And under COVID-19, we see this crisis of our our state governments, right, competing on a private market, right, for goods like PPE and other hospital goods, along with private companies, and where this is just kind of like the tip of the iceberg of what happens when you allow private sector solutions and you point to private sector solutions for what really are public responsibility and shared public infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And so we're talking about the stimulus and how this is, how the first three packages haven't, have had some relief, but not nearly what we need, and not nearly to the where it should be directed. So what do you think are some of the critical components that have to be addressed in stimulus 4 if people of color aren't going to be the last to recover this time around, as we know was the case from the Great Recession?
So what we've been talking about, and a part of a lot of different conversations with different organizations and coalitions, is talking about the fourth stimulus package, providing direct help to families, and really kind of breaking it down into 5 priorities. As people are getting their initial stimulus checks, that $1,200, we see that most families are spending that money on food. As so many people are applying for unemployment and been thrown into this crisis, it's really important that we have direct money being put in the hands of people, it not being means tested, it not being contingent upon their tax holder status or their citizenship status. Everybody needs to be getting steady direct dollars every month until the crisis is over. The second part that we're talking about is universal health care, and it's close to universal and it's close to automatic and it's close to as soon as possible. It's necessary. We see this patchwork. We see our health care being tied to employment status, our health care being in the hands again of private companies, and profit motive has left us so vulnerable to this crisis, and it's ripping through our communities, especially Black and Brown communities. And it just happens that the impact of COVID-19 on Black folks has an increased mortality rate than it has for other ethnicities. And so it's very important that making sure that people have comprehensive good health care, regardless again of their employment status, is really important. The third one is access to water, as well as water infrastructure. So making sure that people have no water debt, that there are not water shutoffs happening. And then also all of these different priority projects for water infrastructure need to be prioritized. And that is also a way to stimulate the economy because that provides jobs, which leads us to the fourth aspect of it is having a federal jobs program, as well as like some of the things Anne Marie was lifting up, providing worker protections for essential workers and making that a priority, providing sick pay, providing paid leave, all of these different types of things in a really comprehensive job, federal good government jobs, right? Not putting it into the hands of the private sector to play these games around how workers are protected, how workers are provided for, and what a good job is. And then finally, looking under the priorities of the homes guarantee, making sure that people have a home, making sure that people are not having to worry about paying their rent or their mortgages during this time. So making sure that they have relief from those obligations and making sure that people who don't have housing are able to get housing and are able to be sheltered, again, until the crisis is over and beyond.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, just listening to that list of interventions, just sort of like, just thinking about, imagine if we do that, my blood pressure is lowering. Just thinking this would be so much more reasonable. We could move through this in a very different way. So one more quick question for you, Tia. So I know ACRE's been running a campaign against Wells Fargo and has identified Wells Fargo as the country's most racist bank. So what are some of the ways that Wells Fargo has been, and their policies have been racist, and what are some of the legislative fixes that can help us fight back against, yet another, problematic actor in the realm of financialization?
Yeah, so folks go on our website, it's acrecampaigns.org, and the campaign is called Forego Wells, and there's also a toolkit there where you can learn more. But really quickly, Wells Fargo, not only the third largest bank in the nation, has been preying on communities and communities of color in particular for years, both with the discriminatory lending, like Alexis was talking about earlier. They also profit from investment in private prisons and immigrant detention centers. They finance the gun industry, which we know ravages communities of color the most. They profit from anti-Muslim policies. They fund payday lenders and other predatory lending practices in communities of color. They're a financer of the Dakota Access Pipeline. They support police foundations. They trap customers in abusive lending practices, both for their mortgages as well as they sell predatory municipal financing deals to our governments. And one of the ways that they extract from public budgets and hold our cities to these predatory lending practices through, quote unquote government programs, but as a private bank, they've used these really predatory financial instruments to hamper municipal budgets. And so it's really important that we understand how Wells Fargo and other big banks are using their power and their influence in order to advance their political agendas and extract from communities of color in particular in these really harmful ways in order to make a profit. And that's what financialization is. And one of the kind of clearest legislative solutions would be to break up the big banks. We need to separate retail and investment from banks, and that needs to happen, immediately. And it's a power that we have. And another affirmative way that the Fed could be operating, and some of that has started to move forward just a little bit, is to do direct lending to municipalities and to states so that we're cutting out the middleman, right, and cutting out that profit motive.
Excellent, thank you, Tia. That's saw some sparkling out on the among our panelists, breaking up the banks. Yes, couldn't agree more. So our next speaker is Sarah Anderson, the Global Economy Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies and co-editor at inequality.org. And so Sarah, you are not only have been at IPS, but you're a founding member of the Take on Wall Street Coalition. And I'd love to hear about how your work with your home organization and with TAOS has what you've been doing to rein in the Wall Street's abusive takeover, grab of all the power.
Sure, thanks, Ericka. Yeah, I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, and we're a multi-issue think tank here in Washington, D.C. that does research and communications in support of social movements. I work as part of a broader team that aims to reverse extreme inequality. And as Ericka said, one thing we do is we have the website inequality.org, which has a related newsletter. And one of my particular passions for a long time has been tackling the top end of the inequality problem, especially the executives who get paid obscene amounts of money for exploiting the rest of us. And Wall Street executives are really the poster boys of that. And so that's one thing I bring, I think, to the Take on Wall Street campaign, is a real passion and a lot of years of work trying to rein in that excessive executive compensation.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. And so I know that our hope, with each iteration of the stimulus has been, okay, well, they're gonna, obviously the other side is gonna try to put in all these pro Wall Street things. We're gonna, claw back as much as we can. So, how have the stimulus packages addressed or failed to address these abuses that that we wanted to sort of want to put some parameters around? How is that going, and what have the packages done thus far?
Well, unfortunately, the CEO pay restrictions on bailed out companies are really a total joke. To protect these extremely wealthy people, they really bent over backwards. They came up with this convoluted approach. Here's how it works. If a CEO made in 2019, $3 million, then they can make $3 million plus half of whatever they made above $3 million last year. So you see what I mean about convoluted. To be concrete, so say a CEO of one of these companies made $15 million last year, which was the average for S&P 500 CEOs. They could make $9 million this year and next year as they're taking advantage of this taxpayer assistance. They could get a golden parachute worth $30 million. So it's outrageous, especially when you think about how these are companies that would probably be facing bankruptcy right now. And while the rest of us are dealing with all of this suffering, we're having to subsidize these massive paychecks. And there's two things that are even worse that I have to mention. One is that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has the right to waive even these very weak restrictions on executive pay at the companies getting the financial assistance. He could also waive the restrictions in the law on stock buybacks, which companies also use to inflate the value of their executive stock-based pay. And as a former overpaid banker himself, Mnuchin, I wouldn't put it past him to try to do that. And then the second thing is, as Alexis mentioned, the Federal Reserve is also funneling a lot of money to corporations, and there's no strings on that money related to executive pay.
Thanks. And Sarah, so you mentioned the stock buybacks issue, and one of the stats that has really irritated me among this has been around the airlines themselves. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on like how the airlines in particular have come out of this?
Yeah, well, over the past 5 years, the top 5 airlines have taken, I think it's $45 billion and blown it on these stock buybacks, which is just it's a legal way to manipulate your stock price to inflate the value. And of course, that just inflates executives' paychecks because they get so much of their compensation in some form of stock-based pay. So if they hadn't wasted all that money on stock buybacks, they might not even need a bailout right now, which is pretty outrageous. And so fortunately, there are restrictions on stock buybacks in the law, but as I said, Secretary Mnuchin has the right to waive those if he deems it in the national interest. So we need to keep an eye on him about that.
Indeed, thank you. Wow, those poor babies. I mean, like only $9 million after 15. Yeah. I mean, how are you? I mean, what are we need to think about the billionaires sometimes? But well, I'll stop there. I'm kidding, of course. So, Sarah, what can people do? What guidance and advice do you have for folks and how to fight for an economy that's not doing this ridiculous redistribution upward, right? The opposite of the imaginary trickle down theory, right? We're not even pretending to do that absurdity. How can people fight back?
Yeah, well, as other speakers have said, this is a time to go bold. And I think I'm so encouraged to see a lot of the bold demands for changes in response to the crisis that I hope we can test out and then make permanent, right to housing, right to universal health care, there's jobs guarantees. So many of these things are things that we should be fighting for, whether we have a crisis going on or not. And then I think we in order to protect those most vulnerable, the poor and working families. But I think we also need to keep an eye on what's going on the top end of the inequality problem. Whether we have a crisis or not, it's just too dangerous to have people with a personal incentive to exploit their employees, their communities, the environment in order to fatten their own paychecks. And so we need to, at a minimum, demand that taxpayers not be subsidizing excessive pay at these companies getting financial assistance. The House Democrats had some good proposals in their version of the last stimulus bill. Let's revive those. One of them was to cap CEO pay at no more than 50 times what the median worker at that CEO's company makes. That would give them an incentive to not just to bring down CEO pay, but also to lift up pay at the bottom. And yeah, I think that now is the time to be pushing things that hopefully we can show people are so needed in our society, even during normal times, and fight for them to be permanent. I don't think that we'll ever be able to completely deal with the issues of Wall Street power and our extreme inequality unless we deal with both the top and the bottom ends of this problem. As you all know, excessive pay also translates into excessive power over our political system and gives these extremely wealthy, privileged few at the top power to rig the rules to their own interest.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And I was joking about these poor millionaires, but our final speaker, Ericka Payne, works with some of the good millionaires. So Ericka is, as I mentioned at the top, the founder and president of Patriotic Millionaires. So Ericka, what does Patriotic Millionaires do, and why are they so important in this moment?
Yeah, let me just a very brief description of the group. The Patriotic Millionaires is a group of a few hundred millionaires around the country who are committed to three core values, three basic ideas. Number one, regular people should have as much political power as millionaires. Number two, if you work full time, you should be able to afford your basic needs, which we translate into a minimum of a $15 federal minimum wage. Number three, whatever the so-called tab is for running the country, millionaires and corporations need to pick up a substantially bigger share of it than they are right now. And so this group first came together during the lame duck session of Congress in 2010, when it became clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts for incomes over $1 million. And it just pissed me off. It pissed a bunch of wealthy people I know off. I got them to sign a letter, and lo and behold, 10 years later, this group is up and operational and working very hard on two things. Number one, to educate the public, and number two, to educate lawmakers on these important topics. So let me lay a couple of things out. Number one, if you know a millionaire right now, and I want to define rich, okay, I want to define millionaire. I do not mean someone who has $1 million house that they probably half of which is still owned by the bank. We define millionaire for purposes of our membership and for purposes of for whom at this point we believe should pay higher taxes as $1 million in income and $5 million in assets. That is an enormous amount of money. $1 million annual income and $5 million of assets. So we demand that these people pay higher taxes. And let me be clear. If there is a person who makes more than $1 million a year and has $5 million in assets who does not believe they should pay higher taxes, you should assume that they are acting contrary to every single thing that could possibly be good for this country. There has to be a red line. There is a red line. The tax cut that Trump and the Republicans, they basically rewrote the entire federal tax code 2 years ago and handed about $1 trillion worth of the country's money to millionaires. One of our members did a video yesterday showing what the difference between his tax return was 2 years ago before they passed the bill and this year when they passed it. Well, Eric Schoenberg, go to now this video, is $50,000 richer from a return on his tax, while we just borrowed $2.2 trillion to try to get the first piece out of this hole. goal. So Eric doesn't need his $50,000. He doesn't want it. The rest of our members don't want it. And look, the wealthy people in the country have all of the power and money. And ultimately, in a democratic capitalist society, this is a question of power and money. Those are the only two questions on the table. And every other issue that anybody wants to talk about flow from who has power and who has money. And so what the premise of the group that I run is that if wealthy people have all of the power and money and they're clearly using it to help only themselves, then it stands to reason that from a strategic point of view, if we could identify some of the people with power and money who believe in building a stronger society, and let me be clear, our members, I believe they are altruistic people in general, but we don't orient ourselves around that. Our chairman says, I'm not any more altruistic than the next person. I'm just greedy for a different kind of country. You know, I mean, our members don't want to live in a country with millions and millions of poor people and a tiny group of rich people. But let me be clear. One thing I've learned after working with a bunch of millionaires for a long time is that people lie. You know, and these corporate leaders get up there and just lie. So don't be confused when they're saying things, because sometimes they are just lying. And the reason it's confusing is because you sort of can't believe that someone can lie this often, this effectively, and about basically everything. Let's look at Randall Stevenson. He's the CEO of AT&T. He makes an enormous, is it 1,500, Sarah? I can't remember what percentage more he makes. I mean, the CEO of McDonald's makes 3,000% more than his lowest paid employee. Randall Stevenson is up there. Anyway, when the Trump administration was pushing through this tax cut, Randall Stevenson went on a road show basically around America, insisting that the correlation between tax cuts and hiring and jobs was very, very tight. Well, during a 7-year period from 2008 to 2015, and I'm borrowing Sarah Anderson's research here, AT&T paid an effective corporate tax rate of, this is my child, my 4.5-year-old, paid an effective corporate tax rate of 8%. And during that period of time, they laid off 80,000 people. And Randall Stevenson took home $80 million. So, I mean, let's just look at the amount of money. So when Trump puts his parade of 100 business leaders up there who are going to decide when and how we're going to reopen the economy, you should take 100% of those names off your list of people that you listen to about anything, unless you are a millionaire and you're asking them how to make more money. Okay, if you're asking about how to build a healthy society, these are not the people you should listen to. A couple of other quick points, because I know people will have questions. We're concerned about two main things at this point. Number one is this $500 billion smash and grab that Steve Mnuchin basically has complete control over. There is an oversight panel that is being appointed. If you'll remember, during TARP, Elizabeth Warren oversaw that and really made a tremendous name for herself and helped the public understand what was happening, despite the fact that she didn't have that much actual authentic power. She was powerful enough kind of personally that working within a not very powerful construct, she was able to get a lot of important information out. It'll be a similar kind of thing this year. The oversight panel doesn't have a huge amount of power, but it does have some power. Bharat Ramamurthy was just appointed by Chuck Schumer. Fabulous choice. I know this is in the details, but y'all, this is really important. It's $500 billion that Steve Mnuchin and Donald Trump are going to be in charge of leading up to a November election. So if they have the ability to write out $500 billion worth of checks to their buddies in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina, you better believe they're going to do it. So we need some oversight on that, and it needs to start. And the first thing people can do today when they hang up is call Democratic leadership and say, get Nancy Pelosi's choice appointed. Nancy needs to pick that choice. We would suggest someone like a Katie Porter, who has done an absolutely fantastic job taking on the financial industry. That's a big piece. One more note about that. Alexis mentioned TARP earlier and how the banks have insisted, and it just makes me want to be sick to own them. I can't believe I just said that out loud. Anyway, but this TARP thing, they insist they paid this money back, and they insisted they pay it back with interest. Let me give you the analogy that you can keep in your head. So the next time a banker tries to tell you they paid their money back with interest, you can explain to them why they are also lying. Okay. If you are driving a car and you drive that car into a huge crowd of people, kill several of them, maim several of them, run into a building and destroy the building, the fact that you paid the loan they gave you to fix your car back with interest does not mean that you paid back the damage that you did. Okay. So millions of people were hurt financially because of this. The fact that the banks paid back the money that they got to fix their little institution does not mean that they paid back what they owe to us. Okay, to be very clear. So the next thing that happens, so this $500 billion smash and grab needs to not be a smash and grab. Number one, the oversight is essential. It needs to start now while that money is going out the door. Number two, I cannot tell you how pleased I am with our lawmakers and what they did with unemployment insurance. They did a fabulous job with that. They really did. There are some bright spots in this. And you keep in mind, this is a small number of people with radically different ideas negotiating to try to get something that's going to get a unanimous vote. So with Democratic leadership, I mean, I think they've done an okay job so far. Not as bold as I would like, but it's okay. But let's push them. So every single day, anybody listening to this call should be calling Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, anyone else on the leadership team. It doesn't matter if you have a relationship with them. It does not matter if you are one of their constituents. Call them and tell them working people first. Working people first. And the first thing that needs to be done for working people is more direct cash assistance faster. Okay. Don't worry about means testing. And let me tell you why. You think, well, I don't want to give a millionaire $2,000. Well, I don't want to give a millionaire $2,000 either, but it's too much hassle to mess with it. So you give them the money, you give everybody the money now, and you get it back in taxes later. Okay, so this can be efficient. And let's be clear, Canada's given people $2,000 a month for the foreseeable future for 4 months now. So tell me why America, the richest country in the world, is given a little crappy $1,200 to some people, with nothing coming. And boy, is Mitch McConnell ever going to go kicking and screaming to getting any more money to anybody working. And so I say, be strong. These negotiations, these people are negotiating. So we have to help our leaders understand that this is what we want and to stand up to Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. So those are my main things: oversight on the $500 billion and direct cash assistance. Those are two places where we really need to push. And these people making public comments when they're getting enriched or lying dirtbags, and you shouldn't listen to them.
Excellent. Thank you. And I love that analogy, Ericka. Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's all. I'm going to hold on to that. Great when analogies are useful, y'all. I say this as a popular educator. Good analogy. And so we're approaching 5 now. So we told folks we'd wrap the call at 5:15 because we wanted to make sure there was time for questions. And we have some now, so we're going to move right into questions. Again, if you have any, go ahead and from Zoom, use a little chat box to direct them to questions. And in Facebook Live, just put them directly in the comment box. So the first question I'm going to ask you comes from Joseph Sparks. And I'm going to target that to you, Tia, because we were talking about healthcare. But that was you, Tia. Do you think that going to a Medicare for all system would help people in the economy?
Definitely. I think that tying our healthcare to jobs in a country that doesn't have 100% employment, and also as somebody who's had a job where I had healthcare and couldn't afford, right, to actually access that healthcare, we see now when we have a public health issue that health is a public issue, and healthcare coverage and healthcare access and good quality care needs to be the responsibility of all of us to care for one another, because we're not living isolated in a way that one group of people having bad health and another group of people having good health is okay. It benefits the economy because when people aren't sick, they're not working sick. It benefits the economy because when people don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to be able to be healthy or their family members are going to be able to be healthy, they can do a better job with and for one another. And so there's such a, what is the cliche, like a rising tide lifts all boats. There are some things that we need to invest in for the good of everyone. And also a longer question, right, and probably a different webinar is like, what is the economy, right? And what is the successful and healthy economy? In the conversation that, many folks are having right now about reopening the economy, and it's okay if, 2% of people are going to die as a result of it. We actually need to have a radical realignment around what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about what's good for the economy.
Excellent. Very, very good point, Tia. And that's something that actually we want one of our upcoming trainings, pop ed trainings on, because we, some of our allies talk about what is the real economy, right? Is it just, people buying money with money? Don't think so. That's not super helpful.
Right.
Would anyone else, any other panelists, like to speak to the Medicare for all? All right, excellent. We'll move on. So, Ann Manning wants to know, is pointing out that it would be great to get, wants to know, how can we get Unite to get more money into the hands of real people? And goes, $1,200 one-time payment is pathetic, right? Ericka was just mentioning the $2,000 that Canadians are getting. Anyone want to take, what we do to increase these amounts?
Yeah, thousands of people need to call their representatives. And if you know wealthy people who probably their phone calls count for about, unfortunately, 50 times more than somebody else's phone call counts for, especially if they've given money to the politician. Phone calls need to go into these politicians now. These deals are being negotiated as we speak, as we are on this telephone, as we are on this Zoom conference. People need to hear, and primarily it's leadership. So you can call your own congressperson, but you really need to flood Nancy Pelosi's office with phone calls, flood Steny Hoyer, flood Jim Clyburn. These are the people who are going to be deciding, because they have to decide how strong they're going to be in standing up to the administration and the Republicans. Because I want to be very clear, Republican politicians today and the Trump administration, they work for Republican donors, full stop. There is no part of them that believes the nonsense they're spewing, okay? None of them believe in trickle down economics. They work for their donors, okay? When they passed this tax cut, the Koch brothers, the day after the tax bill passed, they sent Paul Ryan $500,000. They pledged $20 million to help sell this crappy tax bill across the country. They stand to net $1.5 billion, okay? So the only thing that can push back on that is the Democratic Party. The only part of the Democratic Party that can really show, that can negotiate this, is leadership in the House. I mean, that's just the fact. Call Nancy and call Chuck Schumer.
Excellent, thank you.
I would just add to that, it is leadership, but also committee chairs have a say, at least in the House. And you may not know if your member of Congress is a committee chair or not, but all of the members of Congress are just like us, sheltering in place if we're, privileged enough to not have to go to work every day. And they're looking at their Twitter accounts because they're bored. So if anyone has Twitter, you might want to think about tweeting at your member of Congress, because it's more likely that they'll see it now than they do normally, because, they're not in DC doing the job that we pay them to do. So that's another idea. And you can, of course, tweet at Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell. But all the committee chairs also have a say too. So tweet at your member. And if you have an issue area, you might want to look up who the committee chair in education is and tweet at them too.
Yeah, we might see if we can also get United for Respect to have Anne Marie help us with her Twitter expertise. Apparently, Anne Marie has a huge following and is really and teaches folks on like how to maximize your tweets. So keep that in mind, folks. United for Respect, Anne Marie Reinhart.
A minute.
We need to use these tools. Well, I think a couple of the recurring themes we've heard from the panelists have been, be bold and contact people, reach people. This is not a time to be shy and not a time to disengage. So I have an interesting question. A little broader picture from scrolling. Lost it for a second. From Fernando. Where are we? Okay, so here we are. Fernando Cardosa wants to know what the group's vision is for the new normal for the United States, right? So, if there are any sort of references or visions or ideas that you have about like what we do want to create, as we build bases and galvanize more folks and prepare to unite and run campaigns. What do you see on the other side? With especially in the while sort of overlaying our victories with the reality of COVID-19. I know it's a big one, so
maybe I'll join in and share a couple thoughts, but I'm curious what other people think. We published a piece on inequality.org recently where someone wrote about how after a big cholera outbreak in Europe in the 19th century, that was sort of a pivotal moment when elites in England agreed that they needed to invest in public health care. And I'm hoping to pick up on a theme that many others have mentioned. I hope that this horrible experience we're all going through might open more eyes to how we are all in this together. As Tia said, investing in our healthcare system is not just about helping people, a certain segment of people, it helps all of us. Canceling student debt would help all of us. I just hope we can spread that vision of America, that we are all in this. Nobody can get behind their compound and completely wall themselves off from the rest of society. They might be trying it now. I know there's, billionaires going into building their bunkers and their escape hatches and all that, but you really can't escape the problems of a society where we have such extreme divisions between rich and poor. And this crisis hopefully will be a moment when more people's eyes are open about that, and they see the need for greater public investment in ways that can make a more cohesive society better able to withstand future crises.
And if I could just add quickly about, we can't get cash to people because we don't have the plumbing to take money from the government and give it directly to the people. There's really only one thing that works real well right now, and that's Social Security, and not everyone gets Social Security. And this was a choice we made. It's real easy for the government to give money to corporations because that plumbing exists. If you're a bank, you have what's called a Fed account. You have an account with the Federal Reserve. There's an academic who says, why doesn't every single person in this country have a Fed account? So one of the things we need to think about what should the new normal be is what are the pipes that we need to build now for the next crisis so that we can get cash to people the next time this happens. And you could do, the Fed could give an account to everyone. We have all these post offices all over the country, in every part of the country. We could do postal banking so that people could go to the post office and get their stimulus check that way. There's a lot of ways we could do it, but plumbing, but for money is what I hope we think about.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexis. Ericka.
Part of my vision is that millionaires pay significantly higher taxes, moving up to a 70+%. And I want to just also challenge people to challenge their Democratic governors. Okay, so Andrew Cuomo just passed a budget in New York that has a $15 billion shortfall. He refused to raise taxes on a single multi-millionaire because, according to his budget director, you can't get money from a stone. Well, let me be really clear. Michael Bloomberg is not a stone. He is a billionaire and he should be taxed higher. Ken Griffith, who bought an apartment worth $235 million in New York, is not a stone. He is a billionaire. Go get his money. And do not stand out there. I applaud Andrew Cuomo for much of what he is doing. And God knows I'd rather have him in charge than Donald Trump. But this does not mean that he should not be challenged. A $15 billion shortfall in revenue for New York State is going to go directly to hurt the most vulnerable people in that state. And the fact that Andrew Cuomo refused in this budget, in the middle of knowing all of this, put that budget through with not a single increase of taxes on multimillionaires is obscene.
Truly, especially in the wake of the most recent tax cuts that we had.
Well, and to Ericka's point, so that he didn't have to raise money on the wealthy, Cuomo cut Medicaid in the middle of a pandemic, which is a really bad choice.
Yeah.
So, so save your fan letters. You can do a balance. Hey, thanks for not screwing this up as badly as the federal administration is, but I've got some pointers for you.
Definitely. Anyone else want to tackle this? All right, excellent. Yeah, those are. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, don't we? But we can do it. And I love, and you also want to underscore Alexis's point about these are decisions, budgets are decisions, they're moral documents. We decided to create the plumbing and the piping to siphon money directly to businesses. We can do the same with Fed accounts, so we can to regular folks. And also, Alexis mentioned postal banking, and just in case there might not be, but just in case there's anyone out there who thinks that, the postal office, they're going bankrupt. Why on earth would we, if they can't manage their own money? Just to be clear, the Postal Service, actually, no, Sarah, may I ask you, because I think you are going to be sharper on this than I am.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to feel bad if I didn't talk about the Postal Service just a little bit. They are facing a really dire financial crisis right at the same time that they are playing such a vital role in delivering packages of medicine and food and other essentials to houses across this country. But their mail volume is plummeting as a result of the economic, pretty much a shutdown. And so they are really facing insolvency as soon as in a matter of months. And Trump and Mnuchin are blocking the kind of cash infusion that they need to survive right now. And so if you're someone who, been part of Take on Wall Street, you're probably excited about ideas about postal banking and the model that Alexis was just talking about. We need a postal service, a public postal service to survive if we're going to achieve those kinds of innovations, which would help so many people. They have longstanding financial problems at the Postal Service, which have a lot to do with an extraordinary burden on them to pre-fund their retiree health benefits many decades into the future, which no other company or government agency faces. But the immediate crisis is caused by the pandemic, and they need a bailout, or we could lose their public postal service in a matter of months. So again, let your members of Congress know we need to save our public postal service, which has a universal mandate covering every single address in this country.
Here, here. And we'll take the final word from our final panelist and who spoke, Ericka.
Well, just one thing on the postal banking thing. People will say, well, it's insolvent. Why not privatize it? On what planet would it be profitable to send a letter from one side of the country to the other for less than 50 cents? The purpose of this is not to make money. The purpose is to move goods from one person to the other and communications. So it was never supposed to be profitable. Yeah. So the fact that it's not profitable means it is merely doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And the federal government's job is to make sure it functions. It's similarly to a road. It's a road, but for letters.
Yes. Excellent point. Another good analogy, and we'll start to wrap it at that. But I wish again that there was a way for me to sort of unmute the entire audience to all collectively sing the praises of this amazing group of panelists. Thank you all so much. I'll recognize you again in reverse order of speaking. So Ericka Payne, founder and president of Patriotic Millionaires. Sarah Anderson, Global Economy Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies and co-editor at inequality.org. Tia Oso, the Senior Communications Strategist for Action Center on Race and the Economy. Anne-Marie Reinhart, powerful worker leader with United for Respect. And last but not least, our very own Alexis Goldstein, Senior Policy Analyst with Americans for Financial Reform. Thank you all so very much for your time, for your wisdom, for your expertise, and we look forward to following up all the great guidance and advice you've given us. All right.
I like this high praise. We got delightful discussion on a miserable topic. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. And if you want more, if you want to get involved with us, more with us at Take on Wall Street, go to takeonwallst.com/action. All right. Thanks all and take care. Till next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.